Hi again guys, I'm Kat Braybrook, and this lecture is part of a 4-part series on critical making. In the other lectures in this series, we examine the systems of power that led to the dominance of a Western techno-myth about maker culture. We look at some critical movements that reorient our relationships with technological artifacts, and we explore spatiality as a critical discourse. Today we're going to take a look at the ways localized traditions of technological disobedience and making have started to decolonize the cultural dominance of some nations over others. First, I have a bit of a story. In 2007, after a number of delays, mass production for the $100 one laptop per child started in the Changshu Manufacturing Center near Shanghai, based on a plan to fill the developing world with tens of millions of cheap laptops owned by kids themselves. Led by MIT Media Lab tech guru Nicholas Negroponte, it was backed by the UN Development Program and hundreds of Silicon Valley investors, and lauded as a groundbreaking idea that would improve the lives of millions of children in developing countries by here, I quote a press release, giving them access to knowledge and creativity for the first time. However, it soon emerged that OLPC had not undertaken a careful analysis of local traditions, dialects, or cultures before they had shipped out the laptops, nor had they done any studies to confirm the pedagogical implications of integrating laptops into classrooms. When calls for these studies started to emerge, Negroponte said, "That somebody in the room would say the impact of the XO is unclear to me is amazing, unbelievably amazing. There's only one question on the table, and that's how to afford it. There is no other question." Reports from educators also started to proliferate regarding an unwillingness on the part of OLPC to listen to their feedback at all. Upon getting wind of the increased concerns and negative reception from users in trial regions like Rwanda, and also due to cheaper competitors emerging on the market, countries started to cancel their commitments. Here are some headlines that show how critical the business community had become within a year. The implementation of technologies on these machines, an Economist review stated in 2008, is just terrible, as is the lack of documentation and support. Others cited the long tradition of techno-fundamentalist methods employed by groups like OLPC as an example of the way digital devices are all too often pushed at developing countries simply to benefit a Western need for moral reinforcement, noting the concern of local parents regarding how their children have become vulnerable to disorientation from their own cultural beliefs. By the late 2000s, only a few 100,000 laptops had been shipped to most developing nations, despite the OLPC's claim of 150 million by the end of 2007. In places like Uruguay, meanwhile, gaps between projected versus actual use of the laptops started to emerge, as shown here, with only 21.5% of teachers reporting using them on a regular basis. But here's where the plot thickens. In 2014, researcher Anita Se Chan reported that something interesting had started to happen to OLPCs in Peru, a nation which she describes as already strewn with the relics and treasures of a technological past we all too easily forget. By 2013, 1 million laptops had been distributed, and, as a local community leader explained, when they arrived, there had been no other option than to accept them. However, instead of quietly putting the devices aside, as many other educators had done in other nations, she found that a collective decision had been made to remake them instead. At shared machine shops across Peru, coalitions of rural teachers, indigenous cultural leaders, translators, and open technology activists had built their own critical alternatives by hacking the machines with localized content, software, and interfaces. Here are some of those hackers at work. And here's another story. In India, 300 million people use the internet, but that's only 1/4 of the population. Facebook's Internet.org, rebranded as Free Basics, meanwhile has introduced itself to lower-income nations as an altruistic way for the masses to have free access to digital knowledge for the first time, as it puts it. Sounds familiar, right? The idea of Free Basics is simple. New users of the web are given free access to a small handful of websites, including, and most importantly, of course, Facebook.com. They must pay for more access. But despite being heavily marketed across India, In 2016, after a series of protests compared it to colonialism, it was rejected by India's National Telecom Authority. Critics explained Free Basics was making the web into a two-lane highway, a very limited version, mediated and controlled by Facebook for users in lower-income nations, and a full experience with all the opportunities to rebuild, hack, design, and learn the web for everyone else. So what are the actual effects of this halfway connection on the possibilities to produce our world's digital technologies? I'll illustrate this with a set of maps from the Oxford Internet Institute. This one shows the location of edited content on the world's largest group mapping project, OpenStreetMap. As you can see here, content about high-income countries like the US, Germany, and France makes up about 80% of OpenStreetMap's database. Meanwhile, nations like Brazil, India, and Egypt appear to suffer from widespread content blackout. It's almost as if, on the web's maps, they don't exist. This map, meanwhile, displays the highly uneven spatial distribution of Wikipedia articles in 44 language versions of what is called the Free Encyclopedia of All the World's Knowledge. More than half of all global articles are about places, events, and people inside that red circle on the map, despite those nations occupying only about 2.5% of the world's land area. All the world's knowledge, it turns out, is still built only by a few. In this map of the age of internet empires, you can see the most visited website in each country. Countries in red visit Google the most. Green is Baidu, the most visited site in China. Yandex in yellow is widespread in Russia, and blue is Facebook. Note the areas in developing regions that don't have Facebook as their top visit. Those are currently the nations still being targeted by Free Basics. Through these maps, we see how the world's uneven spatial distribution of digital consumers versus digital makers is all too often based on the kind of web we get to experience. However, as we saw with one laptop per child in Peru, this doesn't mean there is a passive consumption of digital technologies in lower-income nations, or what many now call the periphery. Quite to the contrary. While the periphery is all too often viewed as a zone of one-way consumption and simple uptake of Western designs, the myriad realities are much more inventive than that. Technological hacks are an everyday part of the periphery's technology landscape, Se-Chan explains, whose vibrancy is only partly captured by comparing them to formal or established commercial markets of digital goods. As anthropologists Daniel Miller and Don Slater observed in their 2001 study of Trinidad, the internet is not a monolithic cyberspace after all. Today it exists instead as a globally evolving set of technologies with various local realities, practices, and cultural politics. Here are a few examples from narratives of lesser-known innovation cultures who are freeing digital making from its presumptions. In Brazil, technological disobedience is referred to as gambiarra, a form of challenging the proposed technological scripts of everyday industrial artifacts to extend their intended functionalities while shaping new and alternative scripts through community improvisations that are more applicable to everyday problems. Rafael Diaz and Adrian Smith have described how gambiarra practices have led to a distinctly Brazilian set of social technology policies, which reveal the limits of mainstream digital strategies for development while proposing alternatives that build more effective solutions in partnership with communities. The Banco do Brasil's social technology database now lists hundreds of example projects on its website. In India, technological disobedience is found in jugad, a colloquial Hindi and Punjabi word meaning an innovative fix or a simple workaround born out of necessity, a creative hands-on solution that bends the rules of daily life through making. This reconfiguration of everyday materiality is an inextricable part of Indian life. In Making Culture, Locating the Digital Humanities in India, Padmini Ray Murray and Chris Hand have described the many jugad practices that have been iterated on for generations in India as combinations of community-led making-do hacking and frugal engineering, which typically use recycled or discarded materials and other reappropriated elements of consumer culture. Jugad is especially scornful of the capitalist brands and systems of profit it undermines. Amit S. Ray has written about how the concept of Jugad is in its own process of evolution. Because it is increasingly being co-opted by Indian cell phone companies in order to sell subversive or rebellious-looking products, phones which are then often discarded and subverted by the very communities they were marketed at, he explains that today's Jugad practices embody not only making, but also the continued presence of local post-colonial struggles against unequal power relations. By refashioning consumer electronics using playful and irreverent methods, Jugad practices continue to represent subaltern resistance in the face of commodification. In Cuba, meanwhile, technological disobedience takes the form of resolviendo, or creative drive and resolve, a term which is used to refer to a national tradition of DIY hacking, which began during the economic necessity of the special period in time of peace, or the government euphemism for Cuba's 30 years of isolation as a result of American embargoes from 1958 onward. During this time, people had to find ways to recycle everyday objects in order to, in the words of maker Ernesto Orzoa, think beyond the normal capacities of an object, surpassing the limitations that it imposes on itself. The same way a surgeon becomes insensitive to blood, he explains, it's the same for a Cuban. Once he has opened a fan, he is used to seeing everything from the inside. To help build a movement around an emergent homebrew culture of creative methods for reuse, the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces published a crowdsourced book entitled With Our Own Efforts, which united a hacker ethos with that of the state's socialist revolution through crowdsourced submissions from everyday Cubans describing the many ways household items could be opened up and remade into new inventions. Recipes in it range from a step-by-step guide to turn grapefruit rind into makeshift beefsteak, to plans for how to divide a washing machine in two, using its extra motor to build an indoor fan or shoe polishing machine. In China, the technologically disobedient are called shanzais. In the Western mobile phone industry, intellectual property laws apply to every aspect of a cell phone that potentially lie under copyright protection, from its symbols to names, images, and designs. In China, though, a different lineage for the sharing of these kinds of resources has unfolded, one that defies the patent-based logics of Western IP law while championing uniquely Asian values. These practices together are called shanzaiism, which emerged as a phenomenon around 2008 to describe the production of cheap, open, copyright-infringing goods and practices distributed across Asia. Shanzai products are typically recreated from original brand name variants in black market factories, using pirated copyleft methods that subvert manufacturing licenses, resulting in many cheap cell phones. Shanzai practices are also seen in the illegal dubbing of Western films into local languages, and even in copyleft art forms such as parody films and performances. Not only is the present economic and legal context of Shanzai a challenge to the current techno-myth that the maker movement originated in the West, but so is its temporality, as Shanzai predates making. The term was originally used as a metaphor to describe mountain bandits who opposed corrupt authorities in the 12th century. It was then used as Cantonese slang to describe low-end family factories that made poor-quality goods. This evolved into the more philosophical Shanzaiism, which connotes a kind of innovation that is viewed as specifically Chinese in spirit, a return to the richness of traditional Chinese culture through fugu, or a returning to the past. Today's Shanzai live by their own shared code, and are proud of the way their open innovations steal from the rich and provide for the poor. As the founder of China's first hack space, David Lee, has said, if it's going to be copied anyway eventually, it may just as well be open and shared. From indigenous collectives hacking one laptop per child machines in Peru, to Indians rebelling against Facebook while employing Jugad, and from Gambiarra in Brazil to Resolviendo in Cuba and Shanzai in China, the peripheries of our world are increasingly full of examples of technologically disobedient practices that are transforming our understandings of the maker movement, as well as our perceptions of the digital. Traditions like these provide us with recipes for how to decolonize the traditional cultural hegemonies of dominant actors, replacing them with new ways of making and doing in the process. There are many great examples of transformative projects also happening in the UK as well. So for our activity today, I'm going to ask you to turn your own analytical gaze to our shores. So here's your call to action. First, find a local example of critical making or technological disobedience in the UK. Second, why did you choose this project? What is significant about it? And third, now think of how you would subvert, remix, or hack an existing product, service, or tool inspired by your example project or one of the traditions cited in this lecture. Write a one-paragraph pitch for your creation so it can be shared and iterated on by others. That's it for now, but again, I would be very happy to chat about this further with any of you, so please do get in touch at CodeCat.